in the spring of '94, after I'd been here for a little under a year, I discovered what was then the British Columbia Persons with AIDS Society. And there, here, for the first time, I found a real welcome, a place to call home. When I received recognition for 10 years of volunteer service with the Society, I said that, not wanting to be a drama queen in any way, that this organization saved my life, and that's the truth. Little did I realize that coming in '94 from the downtown east side, I was the first ripple of what soon became, from '95 through '96 and well into '97, a tidal wave from the downtown east side. And those were, you know, in a sense, I stepped from the frying pan into the fire without even knowing it, because we faced 4 really, really big challenges during those years. They were years of turmoil and transition and big changes. And the very first of that was almost a doubling in those 3 years, a doubling of our membership. That would be a challenge for any organization. But it was combined with a radical change in the demographic of our membership. Whereas we had previously, when I joined in '94, been a small organization of mostly gay men, small enough to still have a family feeling, a sense of comradeship and such. And something unique in all the charitable organizations I've ever been involved with was that many, if not most, of our volunteers were themselves members. And I'm pretty sure you won't find that at the Canadian Cancer Society or the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, not putting them down, just saying we were different. And the other thing that I recognized that was really important to me, coming from a blue-collar background, active in my union in the forest industry, was that I recognized that we were not a charity like any other, nor were we a service organization. We were, this is my phrase, not anyone else's, we were a consumers union. And I felt very much at home with that ethic, coming from a place of activism. You know, as the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas said, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." I almost took that as a personal motto when I hit the streets, as we frequently did in the old days.
What happened was people like Kevin Brown and a few others who were actually diagnosed having AIDS realized something which is now much more commonly understood, but it was new at the time. They realized that they were actually no longer academics staring at somebody who was sick. They had an illness, and that illness had a record at the time, in that day, of killing 100%. Nobody escaped it. You got the diagnosis. You may have been, we didn't know this yet, you may have become HIV positive. That wasn't going to kill you. But if it reduced your immune system so that you became subjected to 2 opportunistic diseases, you then had AIDS, and you had a short life to live. We didn't understand that, and that certainly wasn't understood within the mandate structure that had been formulated years before, in 1982, 1983, by AIDS Vancouver. A realistic support service that would have other people who were going through the same emotions and the same illness that he was, to share what was taking place, so that at least there was company in this, and he could regain or recreate some sense of normalcy for himself. It turned out that there was a fight, because the umbrella issue was being touched, and the umbrella had never been challenged, where AIDS Vancouver was going to be the place where everybody came for everything related to AIDS. The umbrella simply wasn't big enough. It had not anticipated what it was going to be like to have to give service, support services in particular, to people who were wasting away and dying, literally dying. We didn't anticipate the size, the enormity, and the vastness and the breadth of AIDS. Now we are starting to realize it. We can't contain it all in one place. that ended the fight. And so they created the PWA Society, which was the first PWA society in the country.
I came to Positive Living Society when it was BCPWA. I got involved with them mostly through some advocacy work I was doing against drugs not going to Africa. And I really wanted to see some improvement with medication going over to people in Africa. And I knew they had a very good advocacy part of BCPWA, very good activists. And I came here when Glenn Hilson was the chair, and all of the people were so dedicated. I was so impressed with the work they'd already done before I even became part of Positive Living or BCPWA. I was amazed at how much advocacy they had actually done for people living with HIV. At that time, I was with Positive Women's Network, but as time went on, I switched over to Positive Living, to BCPWA, and I actually eventually became a member of the board. And then Glenn Hilson was the chair at that time. And he put so much work in. I was so impressed with the staff and what the staff did here and the volunteers. I was living in Abbotsford, but I came down all the time because I was just so impressed with them. And at the time, I was the only woman on the board, and I made the mistake of, everybody said to me, "Oh, we're so glad to have you as a woman on the board." And I said, "Oh, I feel like a queen for the day." And then I realized maybe that wasn't a good idea to say. But everybody laughed. It was great.
Well, I'm member 526 out of, I think it's now 5,000 or so. So I became a member pretty early on, although because I was at university, I wasn't actively involved in the society in a political or much of a supportive way. I was, involved in the early walks and so on, but not as a volunteer in the society, except for one summer early on when it was the Vancouver Coalition. I worked in the library for 2 months in the summer as a volunteer. And then school started, so I was off and running again. And so it wasn't until after I was finished my architecture degree in 93, I finished that in 93, so I think it was in 94, I was asked to, I'd started going to the lounge at the Park building on Seymour Street, and met Arn Schilder a few times, and he knew I had a degree in architecture, and at that point they had a $60,000 grant from the provincial government to put in a wheelchair lift. And he said, "Well, you know architecture, would you like to take on this installment of the elevator project for us?" And I went, "Sure, I'd love to." And that turned into doing what ended up being a 2.5-year total renovation of the building from top to bottom, side to side. Because basically they had a bunch of plans from an architecture firm that had done the space planning for them and got all their programming needs met in the building, but that was a gut job that would have cost them many hundreds of thousands of dollars to do, that they didn't have the money for. So I took those plans and issues and reworked it by just changing a few of the spaces a little bit, like the members lounge area, and adding on a second bank of offices where there was an open space, and so just sort of reworked all the interior space.
I used to volunteer here years ago when it was PWA. In the early years when it first came out, I would hold hands with people. I also worked with Upjohn Healthcare for a while, doing home care for people who are HIV positive, basically holding them while they were dying. In the early years, they were thinking of people going into quarantine because the government and the healthcare system were thinking HIV was going to be one of those, and AIDS was going to be one of those illnesses that manifests into a massive thing and affects a lot of people. And so they were thinking quarantine and isolation would be the ideal situation of looking after people that way. They did that with leprosy. I was just like kind of freaked when the healthcare system and the ministry and so forth and so on were thinking of a quarantine act. I'm glad PWA came in and basically said to the government, "You're stupid," in a polite way, of course. They ended up taking the initiative to find out a lot what was dealing with HIV and AIDS, and was able to be compassionate with people who were going through some really scary times. And then I ended up getting other jobs, and that's when I left PWA. But I do come back to PWA, as it's called now, Positive Living, when things go wrong with me. But I believe when other people are having much more problems than I am, have more right to be here than me. I needed them when I needed Ensure to put on weight after the transplant, and Positive Living helped me getting Ensure, which is highly priced, overpriced, and stuff like that. So I could go back from 80 pounds when I was in the hospital up to 160, which I am now. And so I'm very privileged that I'm a part of Positive Living as well.
I availed myself of certain things that the Society did. The Wednesday night support group was a huge part of my life for many, many years. Because it was a safe place where we could come and just hang out and have a coffee and talk about what was going on. There was a lot of gallows humor, a lot of laughter. And you know, when you sit around hospital beds and watch people fade away over and over and over again, you know, there was a period where there was pretty much at least 1 or 2 funerals a week. And that's a whole other issue, because even when you died, there was a whole other process that happened. There were a lot of funeral homes that would not touch us. There were a lot of people that if they found out that you had AIDS, I mean, you just were shunned. And those are realities that, you know, still happen. They're a little bit more subtle now. They still happen. But I think people are a little bit more respectful. But it's still not easy living with this disease openly. Very much like it was not very easy living an openly gay lifestyle early on.